Brookings India is part of Brookings Institution. Brookings Institution is the oldest think tank in the world. It will celebrate its centenary next year. It's also the largest think tank in the world. Brookings India is the third of Brookings Institution's overseas affiliates. Brookings has an office in China. They have a center in Doha, and 2.5 years ago, we set up a center in Delhi. I'm really proud to say that over these 2.5 years, Brookings India has made, I think, tangible progress. We are currently working along 3 verticals of foreign policy, economic development, energy, and environment. And we have aspirations, of course, to expand the research agenda to cover issues related to, say, urbanization, governance, technology, and so forth. The agenda is driven very much by issues of relevance to India. They're driven by issues that are of contemporary importance to the policymakers. And our effort, of course, as always, is to provide research that is of the highest quality, that is non-partisan, and as a result of quality and rigor, we are hopeful that we will impact the policy sort of decision making or the policy community. So that is our endeavor, and I'm glad that I think we are on the right track. Now, as part of this effort, we did institute a monthly discussion roundtable on foreign policy. Now, this was triggered by you might say by the inclusion of one of our most distinguished senior diplomats, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. He is now a distinguished fellow of Brookings Institution, and we decided that we would use his expertise to actually focus on issues that were of importance to the foreign policy community, and we would have a discussion on such issue or one such issue every month. Now, this month, we decided that we would not have it over lunch, but we would do it over in the evening. And the reason, I think, is pretty straightforward. I am delighted to welcome in India the president of Brookings, Strobe Talbott, who is a former Deputy Secretary of State, Ambassador Martin Indyk, who is the Executive Vice President of Brookings Institution. He was ambassador to Israel twice over. He was Assistant Secretary of State for Middle Eastern Affairs. And for a year or so, he was also President Obama's Special Envoy to the Middle East. And I am greatly honored to have Tanvi on my left. Tanvi Madan, who is the director of the India project in Brookings, D.C. And if it were not for her and her great support, we would be in India, in Delhi, we would be considerably short-staffed and short-handed. It's her advice, her support that brought us to where we are today, to a large measure. So I thought that, with this sort of galaxy of experts on literally the world at large, people who have had extraordinary experience, it would be a pity if we didn't bring them together on the same panel, on the same table, to talk about what's happening around the world today. And what is happening and what is not happening is known to all of us. We are just riven by dissent and crisis wherever we look. Whether we go all the way back to America, we find that a man with a wonderful mop of hair and an equally rancid, you might say, tongue is capturing attention in the run-up to the presidential election. If you go to Europe, there are all sorts of issues, whether it's the issue of migration, refugees, sovereign debt, the election of an individual whose ideology is also quite extreme in the United Kingdom. Of course, then you go to the Middle East. My goodness, I mean, what should I say? my own subject of oil and gas, I mean, if I was to look at the countries that control most of the reserves of oil and gas, they are in deep, deep trouble. Just 3 or 4 years ago, they were running a surplus of $600 billion. It is anticipated that they will now run a deficit of $700 billion in 2 years' time. And this is Saudi Arabia, Iraq, not Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar. The political consequences, the social consequences of this financial crisis is something that should worry all of us. And then if you move further east, we have the issues related to the South China Seas and so on and so forth. So I can go on. And I thought that, this is an opportunity. We have an opportunity to hear 3 global experts perhaps talk about precisely these subjects. And I would like Tanvi to moderate that discussion. So may I just hand over to you, Tanvi, and just end by once again welcoming you, and I do hope that we will see all of you at other functions of Brookings India. We need your support, and we would welcome it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vikram, for many of those kind words and for all the hard work that you and your team do here. Thank you all for coming as well. We seem to say every year that we live in interesting times, and every year they seem to get even more interesting for both good and bad. And these last few years have been no exception. On the positive side of the ledger, however, we've seen 195 countries come together and sign a climate agreement. Now you can, we actually might even talk about the positives and some of the kind of things that didn't make it in there. But all said and done, it is quite an achievement. More parochially, at least in the case of this panel, and I suspect most of the audience, it's been a landmark year for US-India relations as well. And I'm going to start there, and we're going to try to keep this fairly conversational rather than having anybody give prepared remarks on the subject of US-India relations, and particularly I'd like, Strobe, you to start. Given your experience, and you've been coming to India not just in your official capacity, but you've been coming to India since the 70s, but both in your unofficial and kind of since you were an official and engaging with Mr. Jaswant Singh, how do you see the relationship having developed, and where do you see it standing today?
What a deeply gratifying and heartwarming gathering this is. I've learned a lot from a number of the folks here and had a chance to work with a couple of you back in the days when I was impersonating a diplomat. Rakesh Sood is here as part of the flying squad that we saw more of each other than we saw of our families there for close to a year. Going to your question, I'm old enough and was young enough once upon a time to visit India when the phrase was estranged democracies. I think my first visit here was in steerage on Henry Kissinger's airplane in 1974. He came to have what was a thoroughly unproductive conversation with Indira Gandhi, and made many trips here after that. And then, of course, came towards the end of, all know the story from then. Wasn't a straight line upward, but it was definitely a form of progress that I think was long overdue and is thriving now. I would just say that from the days when there was a big deal made out of dialogue, there is now dialogue that is kind of institutionalized between the two governments. It's horizontal in that it goes across the all of the functions or all of the relevant functions in the two countries. The Secretary of State has had a number of important encounters with the Minister of External Affairs. The two defense ministers have gotten together. We had your defense minister at Brookings last week, and he had just come from Hawaii, where he'd had a chance to see the Pacific Fleet, Pacific Command. But perhaps most important is the relationship between our two leaders. It's not just a matter of the symmetry, which has led to two very important meetings between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi. It's also what I sense from talking both to Indian friends and colleagues and former colleagues back in Washington. It's a personal relationship that has, I think, among other things, helped in the one really big piece of good news that Tanvi was talking about a minute ago, and that is Paris. Yes, there are 195 countries in the world and 195 signatures, as it were, on the deal. But had it not been for the United States and India, and I might add China, to be part of that, there would be no deal. The other thing I would say is that even when there are, as there always will be, occasional tensions and frictions and disagreements, those too, I think, are being handled with a degree of restraint that keeps open the possibility for working on those issues in a way that keeps them out of the limelight and therefore increases the possibility of either smoothing them out or even reconciling them in some way. So long and short, I would say that in a world where there is a lot of bad news, the U.S.-India relationship is definitely good news.
Martin, the U.S. is in the middle of let's say, a very vigorous election campaign. One of the questions, there's a lot of discussions about domestic issues. The foreign policy issues at the forefront have tended to revolve around ISIS. But one question that I've heard a number of people ask here is, how will this, if at all, make a difference to India in terms of who comes in next year, but also as we go into this next election year? If you could offer a few thoughts on that.
Well, in terms of the US-India relationship, it started its breakthrough with a Republican president, George W. Bush, but it's been continued by a Democratic president in Barack Hussein Obama, and I think that is a reflection of the bipartisan nature of the support for the relationship that now exists. And there's no reason why that shouldn't continue in theory. In practice, it obviously will depend on who the next president is. If it's Hillary Clinton, and starting from where we are today, that's certainly the way it looks like it will come out, but it's still a little less than a year away from the elections. And so much about this election campaign has been unpredictable so far, so I think one just has to caveat that. But certainly the disarray on the Republican side and the way in which the extremist candidates are distorting the race and sucking all the oxygen out of it for the more moderate candidates like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or Chris Christie. It's very hard to know where exactly things are going to turn out. It's also very hard to know what a President Trump, if that's what we end up with, would do in any respect, other than make America great. and everything would be great, and he would have a great relationship with every Muslim country. So where would that leave India? I don't know. It's impossible to tell. So let's just hope he's not president of the United States. But assuming that somehow and it's hard to see exactly how the Republican primary campaign will kind of right itself and in the end come out with a reasonable candidate, I do believe that the US-India relationship will remain a bipartisan affair. And that means really not whether the relationship will take a turn for the worse. I think the question becomes, and certainly the question on the mind of those in the United States who see the value of the US-India relationship for American interests, the question becomes, how do we take it to the next level? Because that's what's happened in the last 16 years, is that Bush and then Obama took it successively through the ceiling up to the next floor, and now the door is open, I think, for a significant move, because all of the vectors, given the interests that the United States and India have in common in this region, in the Indo-Pacific region more broadly, with the rise of China, and in terms of cooperation on all of the bilateral issues that they're now working on, and then on the global commons issues where there's a greater convergence between the United States and India as manifested in the Paris Agreement, and the cooperation over Iran's nuclear aspirations and so on. So it's, of course there are problems in the relationship that have to be dealt with. We have a problem with the lack of the inadequacy of intellectual property protection in India, or constraints on foreign direct investment, or these kinds of issues that we would like to see India kind of step up its game in terms of its trade standards, so that it could become part of TPP. But those, I do not see those issues as major impediments to a further strengthening and deepening of the relationship.
Ambassador Menon, where would India like to see the US step up its game? What would India like to see from not just Washington, but kind of the US broadly? And that next level that Martin talked about, what would that look like?
Well, it's interesting, because if you think you've said, things with Pakistan, with Afghanistan, you'd have had a long list of political issues. Today you have a strange situation. You actually have huge strategic glue. All the big things, ISIS, the return of geopolitics in Asia-Pacific, all this actually has brought us together. Contested commons, whether it's the high seas, whether it's cyberspace, all these are actually issues on which we work together. So you have strategic glue. The politics of it, we actually know how to handle. And I think we've been successful in handling it, and to the point where you could probably say that India-U.S. relations are in the best place they've ever been so far. But the challenges are all on the economic side, where we actually expected it all to work much more smoothly. We thought that would be the engine of the relationship and would take us through. And this, for 3 or 4 reasons, because if you look around us now, since 2008, we've actually seen the fragmentation of the globalized trade and investment system that we got used to, that India did very well out of, second only to China actually as a beneficiary, if you look at the 2 decades before that. But today you have TPP, you have RCEP going on. You're not quite sure how all these are going to work together. Is this globalized economy being broken down? You have new sets of standards being set, not just on IPR, which Martin mentioned, but on various other things. So it's actually those issues which we have So if you ask me, are you confident we can deal with it? I'm very confident we can deal with most of the political and strategic issues that we have to deal with. Because there's enough glue there, we have the experience of actually handling really tough issues. But I'm not so sure. And I think that's where the problem is. When the US says that they see the rise of India as being in US interest, if that's so, the US has to help us to create an external environment which helps the transformation of India. And that's not what's happening. So most of the issues, most of the demands that we would make on the US would actually be, they will even look retrogressive, because we'd say, please go back to the open system. You need to go back to a system where there's space for India to rise. Yes, it's a time of scarcity. You know, take a simple example. Today, both the US and China are onshoring. The global value chains, global manufacturing chains, for different reasons. China, as she moves up the value chain. The US, as she tries to use technology, digital manufacturing, robotics, and so on, and it becomes economically actually sensible for the US to start onshoring. So we have maybe another 10 years or so where we can continue doing the old things. But we need, together with the US, to be ready for 10 years from now. For how do you deal with a world where a very different economic world? There's no going back to pre-2008. And I think that's the real challenge that we need to actually address. So it'll be issues as global economy. And can we really look at the US? That's why US politics also becomes important to us. Because there is bipartisan consensus in the US and in India on the relationship. I think we've achieved it. And if you go back all the way back to Bill Clinton's time, up to now, on the US side, in our case as well, it's been successive. NDA, UPA, UPA2, now NDA again. So I think you have that, but will US politics support the kind of expansive role for the US in the global economic order that the rise of India would require? I mean, that's, I think, for me, the question. I'll stop there.
Strobe, Ambassador Menon talked about kind of the role of the US and this question of in the international, or not just the international economic order, but do you see it changing or maintaining its existing role over the next few years? This is a subject of some debate, what the US role in the world will look like, not just in the US, but obviously being watched closely around the world. What is your opinion on that subject?
A big and important question that I'll only be able to make a gesture towards answering. And perhaps one way to do it, or to at least frame it, is to frame it around the ambitions, the aspirations, the worldview that Barack Obama brought to the presidency 7+ years ago. It's hard to imagine a more globalized American, if I can put it that way. He, in so many ways, represents the extent to which we are a globalized society. We are a nation of immigrants, which of course makes some of the despicable themes in the presidential discourse, if I can call it that, so un-American. But he also was a child of the late Cold War, and somebody who came of age when the Cold War was ending. And with the end of the Cold War, the leadership of the United States, and I think the foreign policy elite, saw an opportunity where America could play a role that still had a significant component of hard power, which it was prepared to use, but also had an opportunity to deploy more of its soft power. And in particular, to use the progress that the end of the Cold War made possible in regional governance and multilateral global institutions. And I think President Obama both won the presidency in large measure because he was following or seeking to succeed in office a president who had gone back to the use of hard power big time in Afghanistan and Iraq. And by the end of the Bush 43 presidency, those two ventures were not doing very well, to put it mildly. And the American people were hoping that there might be another way to deal with the world. And it was in that context that Obama was able to get elected, and not just because he found a useful campaign slogan, but because he very much believed in it. I'm sure you all remember that one of the resonant lines in his inauguration address was he would hold out an open hand rather than a fist to those who had been enemies of the United States, and he had very much in mind two countries, Iran and Cuba. So that was then. This is now. And as Martin has put it in a couple of contexts in recent days, what we have seen is a return to geopolitics of a very dangerous and atavistic kind, a kind of geopolitics that has brought the world to war, and indeed twice to world war in the past century. So that's the backdrop of what I think is a real quandary today as to what the United States can do to address what I would call a crisis of governance, a global crisis of governance. I don't know of practically any, I'll say practically any, countries that whose citizens or subjects, depending on whether they're democracies or not, are satisfied with the governance of their own countries. And on top of that, there has been this phenomenon of, I still can't quite get over the coining of a phrase in the 21st century of ungoverned spaces. And then, of course, there is the ultimate, but unfortunately, all too germane phenomenon of a non-state actor proclaiming itself to be a state, seeking to rule that state by the most brutal and obscurantist, almost medieval 7th century means, and yet making ingenious use and successful use out of the most modern technology. And I'm not talking about machetes. I'm talking about Twitter and Facebook and that kind of thing. So this is going to be a very anticlimactic last thought. We don't know what kind of world or what happened to cause this, in the U.S., but I suspect this is a feeling around the world. We don't understand the phenomenon, and we're groping for an answer. But if I could, I'd like actually to lateral, having invoked Martin a minute ago, to what is at least a germ of some hope in the United States, and that is that among what I will call the foreign policy cadres of the two major parties in the United States, there is, I think, and Martin, if you would maybe speak to this, there is a commonality of view. I'm not sure that President Trump's Secretary of State or National Security Advisor is in that group, but let's just put that phenomenon ahead, not ahead, how did I say that? What ahead? Put that aside, and one more thing on the election before, if Martin will pick up on this. American presidential elections are won in the center. We're not that changed a society. Whenever a major party nominates somebody who is at the far end or the extreme of that party's ideological spectrum, to coin a phrase, he's a loser. You want to just pick up on?
Yeah, well, just quickly. I think that the policy space in the center that Strobe describes, has shrunk over the last 8 years as the debate in Washington on all policy issues, but particularly on foreign policy, has become increasingly polarized, and as the two sides have moved to one to the left and the other to the right, the ground in the center has shrunk, and that's especially true now that we have a kind of echo chamber media in which everybody gets to listen to the point of view that they like, and the news gets filtered in that way, and so it just reinforces this polarization. And it's reinforced again by the way in which the political map is divided essentially between blue and red states in a way that leaves contested territory and also very narrow, down to like 7 states. So in that context, there is now a move, at least on the foreign policy side, to try to find a way to expand the center. And for Republican foreign policy people and Democratic foreign policy people to come together and build on what they have in common. Brookings is involved in this exercise, actually sponsoring this exercise. And it's quite heartening for those who would like to see a more centrist foreign policy, just how strong the common language is. And so, again, this may be Pollyannish, given that the more extreme outcomes are certainly possible. But I do think that there is at least as good a chance that we will see, following Strobe's principle that elections are won in the center, that the next president will either be from the center left or the center right, and the difference between them will actually be quite small. Harder line because of the rise of geopolitics and therefore a greater willingness to resort to hard power than our current president, but also a greater commitment to the issues that we talk about in terms of global commons, that balances the need to deal with geopolitical challenges with the understanding that we share a planet and that we need to deal with issues like climate and nuclear proliferation and terrorism and pandemics. We would see, I think, the world had come to expect and has missed for quite a long time.
Martin, one of the things I want to ask you about one of the things Strobe mentioned, which is the non-state actor proclaiming itself here a lot, the Middle East, which is the rise of ISIS, which will be much debated in, and already is being in the US, and what to do about it, not just in the US, in Europe. I'm going to ask Ambassador Menon about how India sees this phenomena as well. But what is the nature of the options that not just the US but other countries have?
Well, ISIS presents a very difficult challenge. It has arisen out of the collapse, the failure of two states to its people, and in Iraq, the consequence of American engagement to remove Saddam Hussein and the collapse of state institutions that then followed. And ISIS is kind of Al-Qaeda 2.0, but its difference with Al-Qaeda is that it seeks to control territory, which Al-Qaeda never sought to do. Therein lies what should be its essential vulnerability. A terrorist organization that takes control of territory is placed in the dilemma, places itself in the dilemma. Does it fight the infidel, or does it feed the people? And normally that kind of dilemma leads to considerable ineffectiveness at that point. And the best example of that is Hamas taking over Gaza and finding itself unable to resolve that dilemma effectively, and therefore unable to achieve its broader objectives other than just holding on to that territory in Gaza because nobody else wants to control it. In ISIS' case, it constantly surprises us, and I think that's something we need to get our heads around, is that it is a disruptor. And so it's taken control of territory, and it's actually, through a combination of deep brutality, intimidated the people, and on the other hand, managed to set up institutions that function so that you do not see in the territory it controls, because of this combination, a kind of revolt against them, notwithstanding the incredible strictures that they place on the population. What would seem to us to be a complete horror show. And yet, 8 million people under ISIS control, and it's not leading to the kind of discontent that Osama bin Laden predicted would happen, and why he was so against taking control of territory. So it presents us with a very difficult challenge. Send in two divisions, and you have to answer two questions. The first is, isn't that exactly what ISIS wants? Because its vision is an apocalyptic vision in which it seeks to bring on a clash of civilizations. It seeks an end of days conflict with the West, and would use that conflict as a much more effective recruiting tool than it already has. And the second question we have to answer is, let's assume that we succeed in destroying ISIS. What are we going to replace it with? That was the problem we faced in Iraq, in Afghanistan as well. And we don't have a good solution to that. And so the challenge on the ground is a complicated one, which I think has only one solution. That is to say that you can only defeat ISIS with Sunni forces, certainly backed by the West and others, but it's Sunni forces that have to take over, and it's Sunni institutions that have to replace ISIS's institutions. But how you do that is even more complicated because for a whole variety of reasons that I won't take your time with unless you want to get into it, those Sunni forces are not readily available. The Saudis have put 50% of their forces down the sinkhole of Yemen, and the other Gulf states have followed Saudi Arabia's lead. The Sunni militias in Iraq feel betrayed by the United States and don't feel that they have a part in an Iraq that's controlled by Shias backed by Iran. The Sunni opposition forces in Syria are committed more to fighting Assad than they are to fighting ISIS. And of course the Turks want to fight the Kurds more than they want to fight ISIS. So
You might mention the Russians.
well, the Russians have intervened on the side of Assad, and they're not fighting ISIS at all, although they've seemed to convince the world that that's what they're really about. They're bombing the Sunni forces that are opposing Assad. So in those circumstances, you don't have yet a Sunni solution for that problem. And then there's the whole ideological challenge of ISIS, which again is a phenomenon that we have not managed to confront effectively. And it uses social media in a tremendously effective way to recruit tens of thousands of foreign fighters, and recruit Muslims in the West to become radicalized and then act in extreme ways. We've seen it in Paris. Now we've seen it in San Bernardino. How do we get our heads around a mother that gives birth to a baby and 6 months later gives the baby to her mother and goes out and kills 14 people? It is simply very difficult to comprehend, let alone find an effective way to combat it. We will find ways to do it. But essentially the challenge we have, and I apologize to my colleagues because they've heard me say this before, is one in which ISIS is on an exponential curve. They are constantly innovating. And we are dealing with them, we are all dealing with them in a linear way. And the exponential curve has crossed now the linear curve, and they are in a disruptive mode, and we have to get on that exponential curve. I haven't figured out how exactly we do that, but that's the nature of the challenge, and it's a difficult one.
Master Menon, the complicated situation Martin described, the challenge, both in terms of ISIS, but the broader Middle East situation, how do you see it?
Well, on ISIS, and again, I think you've heard me say this before, I think Martin's right. There is a problem here which it's beyond just a military problem. It's not, and it doesn't have just a military solution. Born, raised, educated, radicalized in France and Belgium. Not by ISIS, not in the Middle East, but ISIS was the brand. They reached out to ISIS. And yes, the idea of ISIS helped them to do what they were doing. But the terrorist depends, his goal is to create disproportionate effect with an action. And for that, he depends on the victim's cooperation, actually. Because it's a reaction to terrorism that normally is disproportionate. Exactly as you saw with Al-Qaeda did well after 9/11 thanks to the invasion of Iraq. And I think we have to look at ISIS in that sense as an idea which is being used, and not just as a collection of individuals who run a state who control a certain number of people, and if you kill the leaders, it's all going to settle down. That's not what happened with Al-Qaeda, and it's not going to happen with ISIS either. The real question, and it has an environment in the Middle East which are fragmented or weak state structures within which it's flourishing, and weak social structures as well. The real question we should be asking ourselves is, why don't the states of the region actually see ISIS as a threat to themselves? or to their survival. It's a threat to the rest of the world. The rest of the world is making this big fuss about how ISIS is about to get them. But why don't those states see it? Are they so blind? Are they so, I mean, is human folly so? I'm not so sure. And I think that's the question we need to answer, because the only answer to ISIS, as Martin said, is on the ground in the Middle East by people from the Middle East itself, not by the rest of the world. I was shocked after Paris when I saw headlines in the Indian papers saying, is ISIS coming to India? I think that's the wrong question. The question we should be asking is, are we creating conditions in India? Are we alienating people to the point where we are ripe for ISIS, for them to start looking at ISIS? And I think that's the way we should be looking at the question. There will always be some extreme, radical, alienated, dispossessed, disempowered, whatever individuals who feel dispossessed, disempowered, who will be attracted to organizations like that. But the important is an explosive combination. So I'm not sure that you have a simple way forward out of this. Thanks.
Strobe.
A couple of things that Shankar just said brought the following thought to my mind. One of the most unfortunate and wrong, in my view, wrong-headed questions, and sometimes it's posed as a rhetorical question, that is, the questioner knows what he thinks the answer is. What is it about Islam that has created this phenomenon? I think that is a misguided, to put it mildly, and in some ways a dangerous question. Everybody in this room knows the answer to the following question. I wish more people in the United States of America knew the answer to the question. What are the two largest Muslim countries? ISIS hasn't come to them, and it hasn't come from them. Yet they are huge Islamic Muslim communities. And there is something, obviously, empirically, about the way in which those communities have been incorporated into pluralistic, syncretic civilizations and states that has spared those countries, your country, from being either on the supply side or on the demand side. So, yes, of course, religion and politics is a legitimate subject, but it shouldn't be generalized in the way that it is now being generalized to suggest that there is something in Islam itself that has triggered this. And I think those of us who live in countries where there are Muslim minorities have to look not just at the dynamics within the tiny community in Southern California, where Mr. Farouk and Miss Malik did their thing, but what was it about those communities?
While we're on the subject of the Middle East, and we won't spend too much time on this because I want to pivot to Asia a little bit before we turn to audience Q&A, but while we're on the subject of the Middle East, I can't resist, because we've got two ambassadors, former ambassadors to Israel on stage, to ask about Prime Minister Netanyahu's pivot to Asia as well. Martin, why is Bibi pivoting to Asia to some extent? And Ambassador Menon, what is it about the relationship with Israel that across governments now, we've seen a deepening of the relationship, and where do you see it going over the next year?
Well, thanks for reminding me, Tanvi, that I first met Shankar when he was ambassador to Israel, and I was ambassador to Israel, and our children went to the same school in the same year, so that's how we became friends originally. Back in the good old days when Yitzhak Rabin was Prime Minister of Israel and Israel was forging ahead in the peace process in a partnership with Bill Clinton and the United States, and I had the honor to represent Clinton in Israel. The answer to your question, Tanvi, is I think quite straightforward. Netanyahu would rather avoid having to deal with the Palestinian problem that presents a huge political danger zone for him, and is like any viable solution will likely doom his government, and he's not prepared to take that risk. So he looks elsewhere, and as Israel's, as a result of that, as Israel's problems increase with the West, particularly with Europe, with the United States further behind, but in particular with Europe, he looks to Asia to try to find markets and alternatives. Of course, the Israeli-Indian relationship predates Netanyahu, and as does the Israeli-Chinese relationship. These were both given a turbo boost in the Rabin era, and Shankar can speak to that, precisely because Israel was moving forward on the Palestinian problem that opened that door. But now the relationships, I think, have taken sufficient root. There's sufficient common interest, particularly with the rise of Islamic jihadist extremism as a threat that Israel, India, and China share in common. You see that Netanyahu is able to build on that and try to strengthen the relationship in this part of the world. I think it's as simple as that. I also think there are limits to how far it can go, as much as Israelis like to think of themselves as a superpower, they're not.
Well, I think as far as India and Israel is concerned, we've had a relationship for a very long time. There was a Jewish population in India from the diaspora after the first temple was destroyed. And we faced an 8-day oil boycott by Saudi Arabia in the early 70s because of that relationship. Even though we didn't have an embassy, when we opened the embassy in '92, actually it was Yasser Arafat who encouraged us to do so, because there was movement after the Oslo process, after the Oslo meetings, in what was happening between the Palestinians. And Yasser Arafat wanted friends at court. He wanted people who would urge sensible policies on the Israelis. The fact is that the relationship is, I think, outgrown that. If you look at it both in economic terms, on the defense side, in agriculture, in water, there's a whole host of areas in which the relationship has grown. And this government in India is willing politically to be seen to be making much more visible commitments to that relationship. So it's been an organic process of growth in this relationship. And Martin's spoken to why the Israelis look at this and look at China as well and look increasingly to Asia. Because I think, I'm not sure about the Israelis, but certainly I was struck by how strong the boycott movement and the feeling in West Europe is today about Israeli practices in the West Bank and Gaza and with the Palestinians and so on. And I think that's something which naturally drives Israel eastwards. How will it go with us? I think a lot depends on what happens not just in the bilateral relationship, but in the region itself. We saw some of that complication when our president was in Israel, and we saw what happened. But those are things that I think we'll just have to deal with the complexity of it. But as long as it's useful, it helps us to transform India. I think that's the relationship we'll work on.